The year was one of quiet normalcy, or so it seemed. Nestled among rolling hills and dirt roads sat a town so ordinary, so forgettable, that history itself might have overlooked it, had not calamity struck with such merciless suddenness. At first, it was subtle. A farmer collapsed in his field, clutching his stomach as his wife ran for help. That very evening, a child doubled over at the supper table, her face pale, her cries piercing the quiet night. By dawn, an entire street was echoing with coughing, retching, and moans of anguish. Doctors were summoned, their leather bags rattling with tonics and tools, but they found no clear culprit. Was it spoiled meat, bad water, some invisible pestilence creeping through the wells and pantries? The physicians scratched their heads, and the priests rang their bells. And yet, what no one dared consider, what even the most suspicious mind failed to utter aloud, was that this was no accident of nature, no wrath of God. This was the careful orchestration of a single woman. One hand, quiet as a shadow, had salted their meals with death. She walked among them as they gasped for air, as children wept and fathers died. Calm, composed, a face of sympathy, and no one, not a single soul, realized that she was the storm at the heart of their suffering. By the time the town understood, the damage was done. Families lay broken, reputations ruined, and history had gained one of its most chilling puzzles: how one woman poisoned an entire town and walked free. Before the sickness crept in, the town breathed with a rhythm of ordinary life. Dirt roads cut through fields of corn and wheat, horses trotted along wooden fences, and the clang of blacksmith hammers echoed through the air. It was a place where everyone knew one another's names, where doors were left unlocked, and gossip traveled faster than the church bell on Sunday morning. Men worked the fields and workshops from dawn to dusk. Women tended to gardens, traded recipes, and looked after the young. Children roamed barefoot across pastures, their laughter rising against the warm wind. It was a town proud of its self-reliance, proud of the fact that unlike the crowded cities beyond the horizon, theirs was a community untouched by crime, corruption, or calamity. At the center of it all stood the church, its steeple cutting into the sky, ringing out at sunrise and dusk. To the townsfolk, that bell was more than metal and rope. It was a symbol of order, of trust, of safety. People believed that whatever storms raged beyond their borders, here, in this little haven, they were protected. But safety has always been an illusion. Trust is the sweetest poison, and in this town, everyone drank it. They welcomed strangers with open arms. They ate what neighbors cooked. They never questioned the milk, the bread, the soup shared at gatherings. Why would they? Evil, after all, was something that belonged to faraway cities, not to them. And so they lived unaware, their sense of peace nothing more than a fragile glass, one that would shatter the moment a certain woman stepped into their lives. No one could quite recall when she first arrived. Some swore she had always been there, lingering at the edges of gatherings with her head lowered. Others remembered her arrival as sudden, a widow, perhaps, or a woman who claimed to have lost her family elsewhere, looking for a place to begin again. Her presence was quiet, unassuming. She dressed plainly, spoke softly, and never raised her voice above a murmur. To the townsfolk, she was someone to be pitied rather than feared. She carried herself with the kind of frailty that made people lean in, eager to help. And so they welcomed her, offering food, small work, and, most of all, trust. But behind her subdued smile lay something unreadable. She had an unusual interest in herbs, powders, and remedies. The townsfolk assumed it was knowledge passed down through generations, the sort of folk medicine common in rural places. They didn't question the little pouches she carried or the glass jars she kept tucked under her shawl. Why would they? She offered tinctures for coughs, balms for headaches, and teas that promised sleep. In the evenings, she was seen walking the lanes with baskets of bread or stew, always eager to help a sick neighbor. She gave freely, too freely, her hands always moving, her eyes always watching. And yet, there were whispers. Children said her stare lingered too long. Farmers noted how she never seemed to eat what she cooked. Some muttered that her past was a blank slate, that no one really knew where she came from. Still, the town, bound by kindness and naivety, dismissed suspicion. Evil could not take such a gentle form, they thought, but the truth was already at their door. The woman had not come seeking peace. She had come with death in her pockets. It began at a gathering, as these things often do. A church supper, perhaps, or a harvest feast where long wooden tables groaned beneath pies, breads, and steaming pots of stew. The whole town came together, laughing, sharing stories, filling their plates with the comfort of familiarity. No one noticed the woman's hands as she moved among the dishes. She ladled soup, sliced bread, poured cider with a faint, deliberate smile. To anyone walking, she was nothing more than a generous neighbor eager to serve, but by the next morning her kindness had revealed its true cost. Children were the first to fall ill. Mothers found their little ones pale and sweating, writhing in their beds. Then it spread to the men who had eaten heartily, their stomachs twisting in violent agony. Coughing fits rattled homes. The streets echoed with retching. Doctors were called in haste, their stethoscopes pressed against chests, their notebooks scribbled with symptoms. Food poisoning, they said. A bad cut of meat, spoiled milk, nothing more. The townsfolk nodded, clinging to the comfort of an explanation. Any explanation that didn't involve betrayal. But the sickness didn't stop. Within days, nearly a dozen households were stricken. Some families lost half their members in a single week. The town's graveyard filled with fresh soil, shovels clanging against wood as prayers were whispered over small, hurried burials. And through it all, the woman was there. She visited homes with bowls of broth, sat by the sickbeds with folded hands, whispering words of comfort. To grieving families, she appeared angelic, a figure of compassion in their darkest hours. What no one knew, what no one could yet prove, was that her touch carried the very sickness she pretended to fight. The town was not facing an outbreak. It was facing her. The sickness was no longer an isolated misfortune. It was everywhere. By the second week, nearly every household had a victim. The streets once filled with the sound of horses and children's laughter now carried only the tolling of church bells and the groans of the dying. Fear spread faster than the illness itself. Families bolted their doors, refusing to share food with neighbors. Once trusted wells were abandoned, their buckets left to rot in the sun. Farmers accused one another of selling spoiled grain. Women whispered that perhaps God was punishing them, that sin had seeped into the town and cursed them all. The church pews filled with trembling bodies, heads bowed in desperate prayer. Priests preached about divine wrath, warning that repentance was the only cure. Some blamed outsiders, travelers passing through, immigrants who had arrived weeks before. Torches were lit, mobs formed, suspicion spilling like wildfire through the streets. And yet, amid the chaos, one figure moved unchallenged: the woman. She entered homes with baskets of food and bottles of medicine. She prayed with the sick, wiped their foreheads, offered comfort where no comfort seemed possible. To many, she was the only soul who seemed unafraid of the plague. But fear distorts memory. When the sickness deepened, some began to recall unsettling details. Her presence before the fevers began, her peculiar calm when others panicked, her uncanny way of knowing who would fall ill next. A seed of doubt was planted, but in a town tearing itself apart, no one dared to water it with accusation. And so the panic raged on, each family blaming the other, never realizing that the true architect of their misery lived quietly among them, her face hidden in plain sight. By the third week, panic had outgrown prayer. The sickness could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Something deliberate was at work, and the town demanded answers. Doctors from nearby counties were summoned, men with thicker books and sterner faces. They carried strange instruments, scraped samples from the wells, sniffed at jars of milk and bread loaves left half-eaten. Their verdict was frustratingly vague. Contamination, they muttered, though none could say from where. Some swore it was the water. Others insisted it was spoiled grain. A few whispered that the illness bore the marks of poison. But with no way to test, suspicion floated without anchor. The town council convened in the church, their voices echoing beneath the high rafters. Accusations darted back and forth like arrows. Was it negligence? Was it God's punishment? Or was there, lurking among them, a hand guiding this invisible weapon? In hushed corners, rumors thickened. Neighbors recalled how the woman was always present when sickness struck, how she had ladled stew, carried bread, poured cider with that calm, steady hand. They remembered the little vials she carried, the herbs she ground in her mortar. But none dared confront her outright. To accuse a woman, especially one cloaked in grief and charity, seemed unthinkable. And so the investigations moved in circles. Wells drained and refilled, food tested and discarded, endless meetings that yielded nothing but more suspicion. The woman, meanwhile, continued her visits. She leaned close to the doctors as they worked, listening carefully, always careful to appear helpful, never letting her mask slip. The truth was within reach, but the tools of science and courage of men were not yet sharp enough to seize it, and while the town wasted precious weeks in fruitless inquiry, her shadow lengthened, and the death toll climbed higher. At first, the deaths seemed random, scattered like bad luck across the map of the town. But when fear sharpened memories, people began to see the threads. Families that had fallen ill shared one detail in common. Each had, at some point, accepted food, drink, or remedy from her. The widow who died after sipping her healing tea, the children who fell ill after eating bread she had baked, the farmer's family who weakened after her stew was served at their table. It was a pattern too precise to ignore, yet still, it was spoken only in whispers. For every neighbor who remembered her presence at a sickbed, another defended her, swearing that she had been nothing but kind. Suspicion and denial wrestled in the same hearts. The doctors, too, began to take notice. Records showed that in nearly every home she had visited, the sickness followed. Some began to quietly question her remedies, her knowledge of herbs, the powders she carried in her pouches. Why did she never fall ill herself when she was constantly among the dying? But what made the truth so cruel was her dual role. She poisoned, and then she comforted. She was both the cause of the suffering and the hand that wiped away its sweat. The town could not yet comprehend such duplicity, a woman who could harm with one hand and soothe with the other. And so the pattern, though visible, remained unproven. The people knew something was wrong, but without a confession, without a vial labeled poison, they could do nothing but look at her with growing unease. All the while, she continued undisturbed. Each visit, each meal, another step deeper into the town's destruction. The sickness no longer struck in waves. It struck like a flood. Entire families were wiped out within days. Rows of coffins lined the churchyard, fresh earth piled high as gravediggers worked until their hands blistered. The graveyard, once a quiet shop, Ornair became the busiest place in town. Children were orphaned overnight, their cries echoing through empty homes. Husbands buried wives, wives buried husbands, until grief itself became another disease spreading through the streets. Livestock went untended, fields lay fallow, businesses shuttered. The town, once alive with industry and laughter, grew silent under the weight of death. And yet, the woman remained. Always present, always near. She visited the newly grieving with bowls of food, offering soft words in a voice so calm it unsettled the strongest of men. Some praised her as an angel of mercy. Others, in hushed tones, began to call her something else. A shadow, a harbinger, a curse in human form. Still, no one acted. Fear kept their mouths shut. To accuse her without proof was to risk turning the town's sorrow into violence. And who among them could bear more blood? And so, the burials continued. More victims fell. The tally rose. The woman's face became the most familiar sight at every funeral, her black shawl blending seamlessly with the mourners. But beneath that veil of compassion, she carried a satisfaction that none could see. For while the town trembled and wept, she held a secret power, the knowledge that death answered to her alone. Every crime whispers a question louder than the act itself. Why? Why would one woman choose to poison the very people who had taken her in, who had offered her food, shelter, trust? The truth was tangled, as motives for evil often are. Some said it was vengeance, that she bore a grudge against the town for some old slight, real or imagined. Perhaps she had once been wronged, humiliated, or cast aside, and her poison was nothing more than a slow, methodical settling of scores. Others believed she was driven by greed. If husbands fell, widows and inheritances shifted. If entire families were erased, property lines blurred, land could be claimed, fortunes redirected, wills rewritten. Quietly, she might have gained in ways no one noticed until it was too late. But there was a darker theory still, one that chilled even the most hardened hearts. That she did it simply because she could. Some whispered she had a fascination with poisons, with their invisible power. Unlike a knife, poison left no wound, no struggle, no trace, but silence. It gave her control over life and death, and perhaps she relished that control. Her calm demeanor, her unshaken presence at every deathbed, suggested something beyond revenge or greed. She seemed to savor the suffering, not openly, but with the quiet satisfaction of an artist admiring her work. Whatever the reason, one truth was undeniable. She was not driven by necessity, but by desire. And in that desire, she revealed something far more terrifying than malice. She revealed enjoyment. The town had taken her in as a broken woman seeking safety. What they had truly welcomed was a predator with no hunger but power, no loyalty but death. Eventually, the whispers grew too loud to ignore. Eyes that once glanced past her now lingered with suspicion. Families that had once welcomed her into their homes began to keep their doors shut. Even the priests, once her defenders, started to question the unnerving pattern of her presence before every tragedy. She was confronted at last, not by mobs with torches, but by town elders and doctors, men desperate for answers. In the council hall, beneath the dim glow of oil lamps, she sat across from them, her hands folded neatly in her lap. They demanded to know why her remedies seemed to accompany death rather than healing. They pressed her about the powders, the herbs, the vials hidden within her belongings. But she was calm, too calm. Her voice never wavered as she explained that she was only trying to help, that she too had lost people she loved, that the town's paranoia had turned her into a scapegoat. Every word dripped with the kind of composure that shook her accusers more than anger ever could. The doctors had no proof. No chemical tests existed that could reveal the trace of her poisons. No eyewitnesses had caught her in the act. All they had were suspicions. And suspicions, no matter how dark, were not enough for the law. In the end, the confrontation dissolved into silence. The elders exchanged uneasy looks. The doctors muttered in frustration. But no verdict was reached. She walked out of that hall untouched, her shawl brushing against the floorboards as if mocking those who had tried and failed to stop her. Justice, in this place and time, was bound by evidence, and she, a master of invisibility, had left none. When the council meeting ended, the townsfolk expected resolution, an arrest, an exile, perhaps even the gallows. But none of it came. The woman stepped out of the hall with her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders, her face unreadable in the torchlight. She was not in chains. She was not even followed. She walked freely down the same dirt road where grieving families wept for their dead. The silence that followed was heavier than any verdict. People watched from their windows, whispers trailing behind her, but no one raised a hand. The law had spoken through inaction. Without evidence, she was untouchable. Some said she left that night, vanishing into the countryside to begin again elsewhere. Others swore she stayed, living quietly at the edge of town, her presence a ghostly reminder of what she had done. Children were warned not to stray near her house, and neighbors crossed themselves when she passed by, but still, she remained free. The bitterness of it poisoned the town almost as much as her powders had. Mothers who had buried children cursed the authorities. Fathers who had lost wives clenched their fists at the sky. Everyone knew the truth, but truth without proof was powerless. And so, the woman became a living legend, a figure both feared and resented, a story whispered at night when the lamps burned low. The memory of her crimes was etched not in court records or punishment, but in the scars of the people she left behind. She had poisoned an entire town, and the world had allowed her to simply walk away. In the years that followed, the true weight of her crimes was not measured in death tolls, but in the shattered lives of those who survived. There was the boy who lost both parents in a single week, forced to grow into a man before his time. He worked other men's fields, his back bent from labor, his heart bent from grief. He never spoke her name, but woe. He passed the old house at the edge of town, he would spit into the dirt. There was the mother who buried 3 of her children and kept only 1. Every night, she sat by her surviving daughter's bed, afraid to sleep, afraid to eat food from another's hand, afraid of the shadow that still lingered in her mind. Her neighbors said she aged 20 years in 2. There were the farmers who could not bring themselves to draw water from the wells, no matter how many times they had been drained and scrubbed. For them, every cup carried the taste of fear. And there were the children who grew into adults with stories that no one outside the town believed. They would speak of a woman who brought baskets of bread and bowls of soup, gifts that smelled sweet but carried death. Outsiders called these tales exaggerations, rural superstition, but the survivors knew better. They carried their scars quietly, not just the grief of the lives lost, but the deeper wound of injustice. To know the truth of what happened, and to see the one responsible walk free, was a burden heavier than death itself. Generations later, the survivor's descendants would still whisper her story, passing it down like a curse, and every telling ended the same way, with the reminder that evil does not always hide in shadows. Sometimes it wears the face of a neighbor. The town never fully recovered. Even as the years passed, as new families moved in and children were born, the memory of what had happened lingered like a sickness that refused to fade. But outside those dirt roads and weathered houses, the world barely noticed. At the time, toxicology was still in its infancy. Doctors knew of poisons, yes, arsenic, strychnine, belladonna, but there were no reliable tests, no laboratories equipped to pull invisible death from a body already cold. Cases like hers exposed just how powerless the law was against an invisible killer. Without a confession, there was nothing to hold on to but suspicion. Yet her crimes did not vanish into obscurity. In medical journals and early criminology circles, the case was whispered about as an example of what poisoners could achieve. Some historians would later argue that stories like hers pushed scientists to develop more precise detection methods. The Marsh test for arsenic, the evolution of forensic chemistry, even the study of behavioral patterns among poisoners, all found grim relevance in cases like this. Still, the irony remained bitter. Progress came too late for the families she destroyed. The town was left with scars, while she became a kind of specter in the history of crime, a lesson that justice often lags far behind the ingenuity of evil. And perhaps most chilling of all was the thought that she might not have been unique. If one woman could poison an entire town and walk free, how many others had done the same? Their crimes buried beneath the earth, their names forgotten, their victims remembered only as statistics of mysterious plagues. The legacy of her deeds was not merely the lives she claimed, but the reminder that society itself was vulnerable, that laws and medicine were always a step behind those who dared to kill in silence. Time has a strange way of protecting the guilty. While her victims were buried under crooked headstones, their names fading into lichen and moss, she lived on. She grew older, her hair whitening, her steps slowing, but her freedom remained intact. She had never faced a courtroom, never endured a jury's gaze. The town whispered, yes. They always whispered. Doors shut when she walked past. Children were pulled away from her shadow, and no neighbor would share a meal with her. But no law came knocking. She was punished only by isolation, not by justice. Accounts of her later years suggest she lived quietly, almost invisibly. Some claimed she became reclusive, never answering the door, letting her garden grow wild. Others swore they saw her laughing in the marketplace, clutching coins in a wrinkled hand as though the past had never touched her. But there was no poetic ending, no fiery confrontation, no deathbed confession, no justice clawing its way back from the grave. She died as she lived, in the quiet. Her body was found in her small home, slumped in a chair, with no one around to hear her last breath. Some townsfolk celebrated her passing in hushed tones, relief washing over them like rain on parched earth. Yet many felt cheated, for she had evaded the weight of the law entirely. She was buried without ceremony, the priest giving only the shortest of blessings. No stone was placed above her grave. Her story might have ended there, buried in the soil with her bones. But the legend refused to die. For every family who lost a loved one, for every home that still carried the memory of sickness and grief, she became a ghost that walked the town long after her death. Evil, after all, does not vanish with a single grave. Sometimes it lingers, in memory, in fear, and in the silence of unanswered questions. In the end, her story was not just about one woman's crimes. It was about the fragility of trust in small communities, the terrifying ease with which poison could flow unseen, and the helplessness of a system unprepared for such invisible evil. She proved that a single person, armed not with weapons, but with patience and knowledge, could unravel an entire town and walk away untouched. The townspeople carried the weight of unanswered questions until their dying days. Why her? Why them? Why did justice never come? No one could explain it, and perhaps that was the most unsettling truth. Some evils have no clear motive, no closure, and no punishment. They simply happen, and history swallows them whole. Today, her name is rarely remembered, yet her shadow lingers. In every whispered tale of arsenic in tea, of mysterious plagues that claimed dozens at once, or of killers who wore the face of an ordinary neighbor, her story finds a way to surface again. She is a reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the woman next door. And perhaps that is why her legacy endures, not as a cautionary tale of justice served, but as a haunting reminder of justice denied. For one woman poisoned an entire town, destroyed countless lives, and then simply walked free. The silence she left behind is more chilling than the crimes themselves, because silence means it could happen again, and you might never see it coming.